the phone. Alright. Let me do this proper. Badass woman of Herstory. My laptop's fucking up right now. I may have to restart it, but the music's still going, so let me just go ahead and try to get this done. So, badass women of Herstory this week. Aphra Brehn, born December 14, 1640, passed April 16, 1689. She was an English playwright, poet, prose writer, and translator from the Restoration era. As one of the first English women to earn her living by her writing, she broke cultural barriers and served as a literary role model for later generations of women authors. I'm going to try to turn it down a little bit. Hold on. Didn't work, just keep trying. She is remembered. Oh, wait. Rising from obscurity, she came to the notice of Charles II, who employed her as a spy in Antwerp. Upon her return to London and a probable brief stay in debtor's prison, she began writing for the stage. She belonged to a coterie of poets and famous libertines such as John Wilmot and Lord Rochester. Brehn wrote under the pastoral pseudonym Estrella. During the turbulent political times of the exclusion crisis, she wrote an epilogue and prologue that brought her into legal trouble. She thereafter devoted most of her writing to prose genres and translations. A staunch supporter of the Stuart line, Brehn declined an invitation from Bishop Burnet to write a welcoming poem to the new King William III. She died shortly after. All right, keep going. Let's go. She is remembered in Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. All women together ought to let flowers fall upon the tomb of Aphra Brehn, which is most scandalously, but rather appropriately, in Westminster Abbey, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds. Her grave is not included in the Poets' Corner, but lies in the East Cloister near the steps to the church. Her best-known works are Oroonoko, or The Royal Slave, sometimes described as an early novel, and the play The Rover. Information regarding Brehn's life is scant, especially regarding her earlier years. Is maybe too intentional obscuring on Brehn's part. One version of Brehn's life tells that she was born to a barber named John Amos and his wife Amy. She is occasionally referred to as Aphra Amos Brehn. Another story has been born to a couple named Cooper. The histories and novels of the late ingenious Mrs. Brehn from 1696 states that Brehn was born to Bartholomew Johnson, a barber, and Elizabeth Denham, a wet nurse. Colonel Thomas Culpeper, the only person who claimed to have known her as a child, wrote in Adversaria that she was born at Surrey or Canterbury to a Mr. Johnson, and that she had a sister named Frances. Another contemporary, Anne Finch, wrote that Brehn was born in Wye in Kent, the daughter to a barber. In some accounts, the profile of her father fits Ephraim Johnson, although not much is known about her early childhood. One of her biographers, Janet Todd, believes that the common religious upbringing at the time could have heavily influenced much of her work. She argued that throughout Brehn's writings, her experiences in church were not of religious fervor, but instead chances for her to explore her sexual desires that will later be shown through her plays. Why does that kind of didn't go with what we were saying? Kind of like out of field or that one. In one of her last plays, this is from Wikipedia, so keep that grain of salt, baby. In one of her last plays, she writes, "I have been at the chapel and seen so many beaux, such a number of plummies, I could not tell which I should look on the most. Another version of her life says she was born to Aphra Johnson, daughter to Bartholomew and Elizabeth Johnson of Harbledown in Kent. Her brother Edward died when he was 6.5 years old. She is said to have been betrothed to a man named John House in 1657. It is suggested that this association with the House family is what gave her family the colonial connections that allowed them to travel to Suriname. Her correspondence with William Scott, son of parliamentarian Thomas Scott in the 1660s, seems to corroborate her stories of her time in the American colony. Her education. Although Ben's writing shows some form of education, it's not clear how she obtained the education that she did. It was somewhat taboo for women at the time to receive formal education, Janet Todd notes. Although some aristocratic girls in the past have been able to receive some form of education, but that was most likely not the case for Aphra Behn, based on the time she lived. Self-tuition was practiced by European women during the 17th century, but it relied on the parents to allow it to happen. She likely spent time copying poems and other writings, which not only inspired her, but educated her. It's important to note, so that means that she educated herself in a way. It's important to note that Aphra was not alone in her quest of self-tuition during this time period. And there are other notable women, such as the first female medical doctor, Dorothea Leporin, who made efforts to self-educate. In some of her plays, Aphra Behn shows this same towards this English ideal of not educating women formally. She also, though, seemed to believe that learning Greek and Latin, two of the classic languages of the time, was not as important as many authors thought it would be. She may have been influenced by another writer named Francis Kirkman, who also lacked knowledge of Greek or Latin, who said, "You shall not find my English Greek here, nor hard cramping words, such as will stop you in the middle of your story to consider what is meant by them." Later in life, Aphra would make similar gestures to ideas revolving around formal education. Still can't turn down, sorry. Ben was born during the buildup of the English Civil War, a child of the political tensions of the time. One version of Ben's story was her traveling with Bartholomew Johnson to the small English colony of Suriname, later captured by the Dutch. He was said to die on the journey, with his wife and children spending some months in the country, although there is no evidence of this. During this trip, Ben said she met an African slave leader whose story formed the basis for one of her most famous works, Orinoco. It is possible that she acted as a spy on the colony. There is little verifiable evidence to confirm any one story. In Orinoco, Ben gives herself the position of narrator, and her first biographer accepted the assumption that Ben was the daughter of the Lieutenant General of Suriname, as in the story. There is little evidence that this was the case, and none of her contemporaries acknowledged any aristocratic status. Her correspondence with Thomas Scott during the time of her stay in Suriname seems to provide evidence for her stay there. Also, later in her career, when she found herself facing financial troubles in the Netherlands, her mother is said to have had audience with the king in an attempt to secure Aphra's way home, implying there may have been some form of connection with the aristocracy, however small. There is also no evidence that Orinoco existed as an actual person, or that any such slave results, as is featured in the story, really happened. Writer Germaine Greer has called Ben a palimpsest. She has scratched herself out, and biographer Janet Todd noted that Ben has a lethal combination of obscurity, secrecy, and staginess, which makes her an uneasy fit for any narrative, speculative, or factual. She is not so much a woman to be unmasked as an unending combination of masks. It is notable that her name is not mentioned in tax or church records. During her lifetime, she was also known as Anne Ben, Mrs. Ben, Agent 160, and Estrella. Her career. Shortly after her supposed return to England from Suriname in 1664, Ben may have married Johan Ben, also written as Johan and John Ben. He may have been a merchant of German or Dutch extraction, possibly from Hamburg. He died, or the couple separated soon after 1664. However, from this point, the writer used Mrs. Ben as her professional name. In correspondence, she occasionally signed her name as Ben or Bean. Ben may have had a Catholic upbringing. She was once commented that she was designed for a nun. And the fact that she had so many Catholic connections, such as Henry Neville, who was later arrested for his Catholicism, would have aroused suspicions during the anti-Catholic fervor of the 1680s. She was a monarchist, and her sympathy for the Stuarts, and particularly for the Catholic Duke of York, may be demonstrated by her dedication of her play, the second part of the Rover, to him after he had been exiled for the second time. Ben was dedicated to the restored King Charles II. As political parties emerged during this time, Ben became a Tory supporter. By 1666, Ben had become attached to the court, possibly through the influence of Thomas Culpeper and other associates. She had also been placed in Westminster in lodgings. What's cool about Culpeper is that later on, they had the Culper spying George Washington, like 100 years after that. And he wanted to call him Culpeper. They just call him Culper. It was his connections to John Hassel and Duke Abel Morrow that led her to eventual mission in the Netherlands. The Second Anglo-Dutch War had broken out between England. Sorry, lost it. Cause the fucking love the laptop, but it's tripping right now. In the Netherlands in 1665, and she was recruited as a political spy in Antwerp on behalf of King Charles II, possibly under the auspices of courtier Thomas Killigrew. This is the first well-documented account we have of her activities. Her code name is said to have been Estrella, a name under which she later published many of her writings. Her chief role was to establish an intimacy with William Scott, son of Thomas Scott, a regicide who had been executed in 1660. Scott was believed to be ready to become a spy in the English service and to report on the doings of the English exiles who were plotting against the king. Ben arrived in Bruges in July of 1666, probably with two others, as London was racked with plague and fire. Ben's job was to turn Scott into a double agent, but there is evidence that Scott betrayed her to the Dutch. Ben's exploits were not profitable. However, the cost of living shocked her, and she was left unprepared. 1 month after arrival, she pawned her jewelry. King Charles was slow in paying, if he paid at all, either for her services or for her expenses whilst abroad. Money had to be borrowed so that Ben could return to London, where a year's petitioning of Charles for payment was unsuccessful. It may be that she was never paid by the fucking crown. A warrant was issued for her arrest, but there is no evidence it was served or that she went to prison for her debt, although apocryphally that is often given as part of her history. Forced by debt and her husband's death, debt and death, Ben began to work for the King's Company and the Duke's Company players as a scribe. She had, however, written poetry up until this point. While she is recorded to have written before she adopted her debt, John Palmer said in a review of her works that Miss Ben wrote for a livelihood. Playwriting was her refuge from starvation and a debtor's prison. The theaters that had been closed under Cromwell were now reopening under Charles II, plays enjoying a revival. Under Charles II of England, prevailing Puritan ethics were reversed in the fashionable society of London. The king associated with playwrights that poured scorn on marriage and the idea of consistency in love. Among the king's favorite was the Earl of Rochester, John Wilmot, who became famous for his cynical libertinism. In 1613, Lady Elizabeth Carey had published The Tragedy of Miriam. In the 1650s, Margaret Cavendish published 2 volumes of plays, and a 1663 translation of Corneille's Pompeii by Catherine Phillips was performed in Dublin and London. Women had been excluded from performing on the public stage before the English Civil War, but in Restoration England, professional actresses played the women's parts. In 1668, plays by women began to be staged in London. Behn's first play, The Forced Marriage, was a romantic tragicomedy on arranged marriages and was staged by the Duke's Company in September of 1670. The performance ran for 6 nights, which was regarded as a good run for an unknown author. 6 months later, Behn's play, The Amorous Prince, was successfully staged. Again, Brehn used the play to comment on the harmful effects of arranged marriages. Brehn did not hide the fact that she was a woman. Instead, she made a point of it. When in 1673, the Dorset Garden Theatre staged The Dutch Lover, critics sabotaged the play on the grounds that the author was a woman. Brehn tackled the critics head-on in an epistle to the reader. She argued that women had been held back by their unjust exclusion from education, not their lack of ability. Critics of Brehn were provided with ammunition because of her public liaison with John Hoyle, a bisexual lawyer who scandalized his contemporaries. After her third play, The Dutch Lover, failed, Brehn falls off the public record for 3 years. It is speculated that she went traveling again, possibly in her capacity as a spy. She gradually moved towards comic works, which proved more commercially successful, publishing 4 plays in close succession. In 1676 to 77, she published Abdelazar, The Town Fop, and The Rover. In early 1678, Sir Patient Fancy was published. This succession of box office successes led to frequent attacks on Brehn. She was attacked for her private life. The morality of her plays was questioned, and she was accused of plagiarizing The Rover. Brehn encountered these public attacks in the prefaces of her published plays. In the preface to Sir Patient Fancy, she urged that she was being singled out because she was a woman, while male playwrights were free to live the most scandalous lives and write bawdy plays. By the late 1670s, Brehn was among the leading playwrights of England. During the 1670s and 1680s, she was one of the most productive playwrights in Britain, second only to poet laureate John Dryden. Her plays were staged frequently and attended by the king. Brehn became friends with notable writers of the day, including John Dryden, Elizabeth Barry, John Hoyle, Thomas Otway, and Edward Ravenscroft, and was acknowledged as part of the circle of the Earl of Rochester. The Rover became a favorite of the king's court. Because Charles II had no heir, a prolonged political crisis ensued. Brehn became heavily involved in the political debate about the succession. Mass hysteria commenced as in 1678, the rumored popish plot suggested the king should be replaced with his Roman Catholic brother James. Political parties developed. The Whigs wanted to exclude James, while the Tories did not believe in succession should be altered in any way. Brehn supported the Tory position, and in 2 years between 1681 and 1682, produced 5 plays to discredit the Whigs. Propaganda. Brehn often used her writings to attack the parliamentary Whigs, claiming in public spirits called good o' the Commonwealth, so though by different ways the fever sees. In all 'tis one and the same mad disease. This was Brehn's reproach to Parliament, which had denied the king's funds. The London audience, mainly Tory sympathizers, attended the plays in large numbers, but a warrant was issued for Brehn's arrest on the order of King Charles II when she criticized James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of the king, in the epilogue to the anonymously published Romulus and Herstory of 1682. Charles II eventually dissolved the Cavalier Parliament, and James II succeeded him in 1685. Final years and death. In her last 4 years, Brehn's health began to fail, beset by poverty and debt, but she continued to write ferociously, though it became increasingly hard for her to hold a pen. As audience numbers declined, theaters staged mainly old works to save cost. Nevertheless, Brehn staged The Lucky Chance in 1686. In response to the criticism leveled at the play, she articulated a long and passionate defense of women writers in the preface of the play when it was published in the following year. Her play, The Emperor of the Moon, was staged and published in 1687, and it became one of her longest-running plays. In the 1680s, she began to publish prose. Her first prose work might have been the three-part love letters between a nobleman and his sister, anonymously published between 1684 and 1687. The novels were inspired by a contemporary scandal which saw Lord Grey elope with his sister-in-law, Lady Henrietta Berkeley. At the time of publication, Love Letters was very popular and eventually went through more than 16 editions before 1800. She published 5 prose works under her name: Le Montreur, or The Lover's Watch, 1686, The Fair Jilt, 88, Orinoco, or The Royal Slave, 88, History of the Nun, 89, and The Lucky Mistake, 1689. Orinoco, her best-known prose work, was published less than a year before her death. It is a story of the enslaved Orinoco and his love, Imoinda, possibly based on Ben's travels to Suriname 20 years earlier. She's also translated from the French and Latin, publishing translations of Tallement, La Rochefoucauld, Cold, Fontenelle, and Brillac. Her 6th and final book was Abram Cowley's 6 Books of Plants. So she did, Discovery of New Worlds, popularization of astronomy, written as a novel in a form similar to her own work, but with her new religiously oriented preface. The History of Oracles. She translated a lot of dope books. She died April 16th, 1689, and was buried in the East Cloister, Westminster Alley. The inscription on her tombstone reads, "Here lies a proof that wit can never be defensed enough against mortality." She was quoted as saying that she had led a life dedicated to pleasure and poetry. Following her death, new female dramatists acknowledged Ben as their most vital predecessor, who opened up a public space for women writers. There were some collections of her stuff made. Until the mid-20th century, Ben was repeatedly dismissed as a morally depraved minor writer, and her literary work was marginalized and often dismissed outright. In the 18th century, her literary work was scandalized as lewd by Thomas Browne, William Wycherley, Richard Steele, and John Duncombe. Some haters. Alexander Pope penned the famous lines, "The stage, how loosely does the stray tread, who fairly puts all characters to bed." Ooh. In the 19th century, so he's saying that everybody has to fuck in her plays. In the 19th century, Mary Hayes, Matilda Betham, Alexander Daze, Jane Williams, and Julia Kavanaugh decided that Ben's writing were unfit to read because they were corrupt and deplorable. Among the few critics who believed that Ben was an important writer were Leigh Hunt, William Forsyth, and William Henry Hudson. Shout out to those 3. Her life and times are recounted by a long line of biographers. Of her considerable literary output, only Orinoco was seriously considered by literary scholars. This book, published in 1688, is regarded as one of the first abolitionist and humanitarian novels published in the English language. In 1915, Montague Summers, an author of scholarly works on the English drama of the 17th century, published a 6-volume collection of her work in hopes of rehabilitating her reputation. They've been reevaluated since the 1970s by feminist critics and writers. The criticism of Ben's poetry focused on the themes of gender, sexuality, femininity, pleasure, and love. A feminist critique tends to focus on Ben's inclusion of female pleasure and sexuality in her poetry, which was a radical concept at the time she was writing. Like her contemporary male libertines, she wrote freely about sex. In the infamous poem, The Disappointment, she wrote a comic account of male impotence from a woman's perspective. Critics Lisa Zaitz and Peter Toms contended the poem playfully and wittily questions conventional gender roles and the structures of oppressions which they support. Ben wrote about these subjects before the technologies of sexuality we now associate were in place, which is, in part, why she proved so hard to situate in the trajectories most familiar to us. This one lady, what's her name? Virginia Woolf wrote, "In a room of one's own, all women together ought to let everybody should let flowers fall upon." I'm not trying to fuck up her quote. "All women together ought to let flowers fall upon the grave of Aphra Brehn, for it was she who earned them the right to speak their minds. Brehn proved that money could be made by writing at the sacrifice, perhaps of certain agreeable qualities. And so by degrees writing became not merely a sign of folly in a distracted mind, but was of practical importance." There's a current project of the Canterbury Commemoration Society to raise a statue to Canterbury-born Aphra Brehn to stand in the city. That's pretty dope, man. Back in the 1660s, 1670s. That was like 300 years before our hippies. Whoa. All right, man. I'm going to take a break and I'll come back and bust a freestyle. Yo.